Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 41st week of 2017. I'm Carl Estabrook. For more than a quarter century, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about American politics for half a century. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things, bearing in mind Rosa Luxemburg's remark, the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. On a decertification edition of News from Neptune, with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. Since radio days, Dr. No has been aiding this program in various ways. No's notes are posted on the blog, newsfromneptune.com. And David, you had an important letter in this morning's Fish Wrap, a News Gazette that landed on my driveway at 6 a.m.
Yeah, it's probably already being stunk up in somebody's garbage can, but or somebody's freezer or whatever.
My paper, not your letter, right?
Yeah, well.
Yeah. Got it.
Anyway, I was just trying to extend the sarcasm.
Block that metaphor,
a
right?
little bit, but yeah, a letter, a kind of modest appeal. I'm not sure if it will be taken that way, but a modest appeal to the Jewish community, broadly speaking, in Urbana-Champaign, to begin to think rationally about what's going on in Israel and Palestine. I'm not sure what's holding things up. I don't really see a lot of passion for supporting the Jewish state these days, but we don't seem to know how to get beyond this basic loyalty and this basic sort of, duct tape on the mouth kind of mentality about criticizing Israel, when it's clear that what most liberal American Jews want is two states, and that our government, the United States government, keeps them from getting those two states. Not that they would be paradise, either of them, but there's no reason for 4 million Palestinians to be living stateless without rights. Not to mention, well, I say 4 million, close to 4 million in the occupied territories, and then the Palestinian citizens of Israel don't really have full rights either, but we can put that aside, even though we shouldn't, and just talk about what the next step should be. And I think given that people pretty well understand now what's going on, hopefully there will be a little, and that, things have changed and the pages have turned, and some of the most ardent local Zionists have passed from the scene, as they say, or gone to that great AIPAC conference in the sky.
That's good. Save that.
Yeah, save that. I've been waiting to use that for a long time, actually. I won't mention names. I don't want to speak ill of the dead. But
a note for the new year, huh?
Yeah. But I think we could start to move beyond. I think I've been critical of Jewish Voice for Peace a little bit recently, because I don't think they should be focusing on the alt-right. I don't think they should be focusing on anti-Semitism, whatever anti-Semitism, to what effect exists on the alt-right. It doesn't interest me at all. We need to be concerned with the centers of power, and the alt-right is not the centers of power. And that sort of brings us to what the centers of power is, because when we talk about what the centers of power are or is, when we talk about Donald Trump, I think in spite of acknowledging that Trump is clueless and that whatever he may have said during his campaign that would lead us to believe that he might challenge neoliberal and neoconservative policies, that he doesn't have the chops for doing that. He doesn't have the chops for hiring people to do that sort of work. He doesn't have any consistent framework with which to understand these things. And even though I would still admit that he has some basic instincts that went against the neoconservative, neoliberal way of looking at the world, it's of no effect And beyond that, he gets a little scary. He gets a little scary with his tweets and with his belligerence towards North Korea and in other areas of the world, in Iran. So we have to be concerned about that, but we still have to keep in mind that it's the centers of power that want to either marginalize Trump or want him gone. And so when people are considering whether he should be gone, like Paul Street was on Counterpunch this morning, the question is how do we think about what it means to want Trump gone, and who it is who wants him gone, and what's gonna replace him in terms of this movement that we're having. Did you want me to stop there so you can throw in a comment, or?
Well, I just Paul Street, who is a friend of this ground and so forth. Yeah. I've said this before. I think Paul, who was one of the most insightful commentators on the rise of Barack Obama, has suffered from Trump derangement syndrome. Mm-hmm. I think in this last year, and I'm surprised to see Paul doing that, because he's nobody's dummy. Yeah. It certainly affected a lot of other people. I want a big sign, or maybe a large button or something like that, or a sign to put on the wall, that declares Trump is not the problem. Because we certainly have many serious problems that could conceivably not only wipe out humanity but destroy the planet. So we're talking serious problems. We've got serious problems here, But the problem is not a result of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is at best a symptom of the problems that we're dealing with, a peculiar symptom. I spent the morning at the doctor, so maybe I've got the symptology on the mind. But the fact of the matter is that the understanding of the Trump phenomenon and of populism in general, as it is said, is a very worthwhile enterprise, mainly because the political establishment of all sorts is doing its best to obfuscate what its actual position is and what's going on vis-a-vis the American presidency. But we've got to start from the fact that this is the weakest American president we've had in many a day. I suggested the other day that if you go looking in recent American history for a president who is weaker in terms of actually making his writ run through the government, you probably have to go as far back as Calvin Coolidge to get someone who is as ineffectual. Now, the wonderful contrast there is that Calvin Coolidge was known as Silent Cal because he did not say things to the press. He did not bloviate on radio or television, there not being a lot of that around in his time. And this man, who is as weak as Coolidge, makes up for it, if that's the word, by, in fact, blustering around and making everybody say, oh, my goodness, is Trump going to go crazy and destroy the world? No, Trump's not going to go crazy and destroy the world. If Trump destroys the world, he will do it as an artifact of the American political system and the use of war as a route to the profits of the American 1%, or as we were talking about before the program began, the 1/10 of 1%. There's plenty to be worried about here. There's plenty to talk about. But the notion that the heart of the matter is Trump, and if we could just get him out of there, everything would be okay. That's not only nonsense, it's propaganda.
Yeah. Well, in defense of people that are talking about that, and I don't think they should be all that defended because it gets a little boring after a while. I mean, Paul has been talking about that every week, and Andrew Levine, who certainly has better things to talk about, has been talking about that almost every week. So that's kind of paralyzing men who identify with the left.
Yes,
I know. It's paralyzing their broader analysis of what's going on. Not that they're perfectly aware of what that broader analysis is. But anyway, I've got 5 things on a list here that I could run through if I want to put it on the table. One of them is just repeating again. I keep coming back, beating a dead horse about this Vietnam program and my thoughts on it the last week. Dan Corkery, our intrepid managing editor who publishes my letters, he publishes everyone's letters, but that doesn't exclude me from praising him for publishing my letters. is collecting Vietnam stories as a sort of a follow-up to the Ken Burns, Lynn Novick Vietnam PBS, the PBS version of Vietnam, which I still haven't watched, and I debate whether I should watch it, because sometimes they say, well, you should watch it before you talk about it. Well, I should at least probably watch the part, apparently, given that the word is that they were very critical of the anti-war movement. I should at least watch the episodes that deal with the anti-war movement, at least to see how furious it's gonna make me. But the point I want to make about Dan Corkery's version of the people's history of Vietnam is that this is not Howard Zinn's version of the people's history of Vietnam. Just lining up people's narratives and how they perceived it may have some value in and of itself. But what Howard Zinn was doing is he was telling history from the bottom up. He was telling history not just from individuals, but from the perspectives of movements. And he was selecting certain people who he obviously felt best expressed truthful points of view in regard to that, whether it be Eugene Debs or Emma Goldman or anyone else that he sort of brought to the fore. So telling history is simply more than people telling stories, and I don't think Howard Zinn meant for history to be that. He wanted the stories told of history's victims, so to speak, or oppressed people, and especially people that heroically fought within movements, which Howard Zinn did himself. But we'll see how Corkery's People's History of Vietnam plays out in the coming weeks if people respond to it, which apparently they are. The first installment was not at all promising. It was from a Vietnam War vet who was critical of the protest movement, who told us we should be ashamed of ourselves, and there he was in Vietnam. I don't have to say any more in that regard. And my second point having to do with the local newspaper, just to make the point that there's a kind of a boosterism that we read, perhaps dispassionately, in the News Gazette about business. Busey Bank, Jimmy John's, charitable contributions to the U of I. Aren't we all doing well? Aren't we selling lots of sandwiches? Isn't Busey Bank gone from being worth $1 billion to $2 billion? How do these business trends actually affect people's lives? The assumption when you read the headline, and these are usually very foregrounded stories, often on the front page. In fact, in all the instances that I think I mentioned, Jimmy John's is on the front. Jimmy John, what's his name, is on the front page because he's opening because Canada is now going to be able to eat his sandwiches. That's a big deal. It's assumed that's good, but what's good for 50% of the people in this country who haven't had a raise, the people who are out of work, the rest of the let's say 90% who are basically just holding their own and struggling to stay in that middle 40%. What does that mean? What does the accumulation of all this wealth mean when Busey Bank buys other banks and increases its assets and has its prospectus? I don't think people realize, and it's understandable they don't realize, it has nothing to do with their well-being, and if anything, it's a inverse relation to their well-being. When Busey Bank is doing well, they're probably doing more poorly because it's rich people who are doing better in this kind of zero-sum game that neoliberalism has created with our economy. So I can go on and on about that, about the details of how the stock market works and how people should better understand how money works and how lending works and how banks work. But we have to begin to get beyond the idea that stories about the prosperity of the few redound to the prosperity of all of us, especially the most vulnerable. Number three, that was number two. Number three is just want to mention the article that from 2 or 3 days ago on Counterpunch by the Russian socialist, I guess you would call him,
yes, definitely,
Boris Kagarlitsky.
That is a vital piece. This is really very important. That's top of my list of things to talk about today too.
Right, definitely. And he did a clever turn by comparing Catalonia and Spain with Scotland and the UK, and approaching nationalist movements and separatist movements in this way in terms of what the interests of the people were who wanted separatism and wanted nationalism, and their own class relations with each other. After all, there are in Catalonia there are Spanish speakers, and I was woefully ignorant of really the social structure, and really am, but what I know from at least reading this one article and maybe a couple of others, is that the Spanish speakers in Catalonia do a lot of the menial labor, and it's not necessarily them. It is not they who want to separate Catalonia from Spain. So there's a lot to talk about there, so we could return to that. I wanted to, and we had met last week to talk about Jeffrey St. Clair's column on Stephen Paddock, the Las Vegas killer. And I think the main points that I would say after just reviewing that briefly this morning, of course the main point that he made was that war, when a culture is an empire and fighting wars around the world, the war comes home. And St. Clair also made the point that the sort of casino culture, the sort of mentality of the casino culture might have gotten to Paddock in various ways, and that the mentality of the opioid culture, of the pain-killing culture, shall we say, might have got to him in various ways. But pointing out that Paddock was a wealthy man, and that's a kind of, again, as I pointed out last week, that's kind of a fascinating thing. And I would only connect that, I just wanted to bring that up partly to maybe tenuously connect it to a long article the New York Times had a few days ago about the apparently epidemic or rampant proportions of teenage anxiety and depression and the article is mostly about privileged youth, okay? Privileged youth. They're anxious about getting into the right college. They're anxious about whether they're going to be able to maintain the standard of living that their parents are in many cases going into debt to maintain for them, and all this, growing up in a very different world than the ones obviously that either of us grew up in. But be that as it may, I just thought it was worth maybe a try to connect the problems of the relatively affluent in relation to whether it's Stephen Paddock or this article on relatively affluent teenagers, and talk about the fact, I get what I would say about that is that in a structurally flawed society like our own, everybody is flawed within that structure, and even the most privileged people suffer in certain ways. I'm not losing sleep suffering over the 1% or the 0.1%, but there's a lot of issues there in the manner in which they look at the world and the way they experience the world in meaningful terms, and that's probably something that should be talked about in relation to Paddock. He had other issues in terms of a father who he didn't know, who'd spent his life in jail, and who Paddock had sort of followed in his footsteps in kind of strange ways. But that's worth putting out there. And then the last thing, this is basically a review of the articles that I felt worth posting to the discuss list. Diana Johnstone's article about the other Johnstone, Diana Johnstone. We've been talking more lately about Caitlin Johnstone, although not for a little while. She, I think, wrote a very coherent piece about 3 or 4 days ago about the Antifa movement, taking it down pretty thoroughly and putting it, not being really personal about it, but just saying, this is not the way to understand the way the world works, and this is not a positive thing. And this is from an experienced woman, shall we say, who lives in Paris and probably knows a thing or two about movements, about getting on, what happens when people get on the streets and what the ups and downs of that are. So I'll leave it there.
The Johnstones, as you say, the conjunction of name and, in a sense, of politics brings together two very different people there. Diana Johnstone, whom you were just describing, is an American who lives in Paris. She's in her 80s, and she wrote brilliant. I mean, she's a contemporary of Chomsky, so we're talking about an intelligent reporter of a certain age. She wrote brilliantly about Bill Clinton's criminal war against Yugoslavia, and the only good accounts we've got in English about that American embarrassment, if nothing more, all those dead people after all, comes from Diana Johnstone. Caitlin Johnstone is an Australian who, in fact, lives in America, 40 years younger than Diana, and has been writing quite brilliantly recently about American politics, and particularly about the miasma of misinformation and propaganda that has been spewed from the American political class ever since the election, including what I was after a few moments ago, it's all Trump's fault. Diana Johnstone is extremely good on American foreign politics. Caitlin Johnstone is extremely good on American domestic politics. One could learn a lot by reading all of what the both of them have, what each of them has written.
And central to that is the idea that I think for both of them that what the Antifa movement partly represents is a rejection of this idea of the red-brown alliance, the idea that we could work, that we or people on who identify with various ends of the political spectrum can work together on certain issues. A very strange idea. Even our friend Bob Naiman is perfectly sensible about this idea that we should be working across these alleged lines, boundaries, and I'm not sure where
But not with Trotz.
Yeah, pardon. Yeah.
Not with Trotz.
Not with Trotz, but yeah. Anyway, so it's just to throw in that idea that
nobody on this side of the fence.
What the Antifa, insist in practice is that obviously if you're gonna be violent and if you're gonna counter protest, you're not going to be able to talk to people. And there still are people that can be talked to, a few of them. And if you can't talk to them, if you can't talk to the ones with shields and tiki torches, you can certainly talk to some of them who are looking at that and not quite knowing what to think about this. Yeah.
A lot of the things we've mentioned so far today have some reference to what I think is clearly the best political website available in English in America today. We don't know how much longer that will be the case, but I'm referring to Jeffrey Sinclair's Counterpunch. Jeffrey is the senior editor of Counterpunch and a personal friend of ours. But I think Jeffrey has quite outdone himself this week with the items you were quoting on that website. And if I were to suggest to someone where could I get the best account of what's going on in American politics right now before my eyes give out in the time that I'm able to read, I would say Counterpunch. Look at that. Read that. Those things you mentioned there. I had several other on my list today, several other articles from the current number that are particularly good. But we have all sorts of things worth talking about here. The program Aware on the Air, which is available on Urbana Public Television and that we're both associated with, you also can get it via YouTube. On Tuesday of this week, considered specifically Diana Johnstone's article that you...
sorry, I missed that.
No, I'm just saying for more information on it. We discussed it there, and I would suggest the first place the place to start is to go read Miss Johnstone's brilliant article, which tells you a good deal not only about American politics, but also European politics. What she's trying to do is talk about how and why these things are connected. It's important because there is I think a dangerous distraction in American politics, particularly anti-war politics, that Antifa represents. We should not be spending the time we do on them, and I blame them for making us talk about something that is in fact irrelevant. Just as Trump's not the problem, finally Antifa, or the supposed American ground-level fascism, isn't the problem either. The problem is that American presidents have killed 30 million people since the Second World War and continue to do so by following the same policies. Those are the policies that we should be talking about and opposing around the world. It's no accident that international polls show that the greatest threat, the greatest fear that people have around the world is fear of the United States. The fear of the wars and the results of wars, such as the refugee flood, from American policy in the rest of the world is the primary source of dismay. That's important. It's not China. It's not Russia. It's certainly not Iran. It's not even Israel. Although Israel comes fairly high on the list, I might say, particularly in some parts of the world. But the issues that we as responsible citizens of this great democracy, I'm sorry, I tend to choke at this point, should be considering is the fact that we're killing people around the world. And we have been for a long time. The astonishing fact that needs to be explained is why we don't notice, why we go on, and in the meantime, the killing in Yemen continues, the killing across the Middle East continues, and the U.S. is sending more troops into Afghanistan. This is what we should be talking about. And the excuses that are being developed for this behavior, for the possibility of ignoring it, are even more disturbing. When we have perfectly serious people screaming that this is all a result of white supremacy and we have to fight white supremacy, we are engaged in a tremendous exercise of missing the point. We're not killing people in the Middle East for white supremacy. White supremacy is not a good thing, but to see it as the source of our problems, I think is false.
Yes, and at this juncture, I really wanted to raise the point about that you were discussing a few days ago on the peace list.
This is the email list that the Local Anti-War Group carries on.
Because it has to do with the cost of war and how we understand the cost of war.
Right.
And I was going to chime in, but I didn't get around to it. So let me
chime away.
Let me chime in now. And so I think what you can say what you meant, but I'll say what I thought you were sort of beginning to kind of get at, is that when we look at the cost of, when we look at the money spent on war, and we say, you were making the point that we could still, there should be money for the other things that people need, even if we are fighting wars.
Yes.
And the point is that because it's the same mentality that wants to fight the wars that doesn't want to spend the money on social programs.
Exactly.
It's part of the same system.
That's
so
absolutely right.
Understand, it's not to be, well, people rationally understand if you spend you throw out whatever figure you want, hundreds of billions, trillions, whatever, this could have bought so many schools or so much health care. And while we have a crappy system, especially healthcare, in regard to that, and we spend plenty of money in the wrong way on that system to have a bad system. Why that avoids the issue of why we have such a bad system, why higher education is so expensive and students have to go into debt for it, why we're not maintaining the infrastructure in a way that begins to address climate change and then can deal with the kind of things that we've witnessed in recent weeks from, it's all related from Houston to Florida to the wildfires in Northern California. It's because it isn't a matter of just saying this money should be spent differently. It's a matter of we have to change the system to stop spending the money on war, not because it's expensive, because it's wrong, it's immoral, and B, because we need a different system to deal with people in this country.
I have had a little trouble with the arguments, which are factually correct, that the U.S. Should be spending the money it's spending on war on other things. That's quite right. I get a little uncomfortable, perhaps the same way you do, David, when the argument goes, well, if we didn't spend the money on war, then the money would be there for us to do other good things. Now, to take that as a reason for not killing people in Syria seems to me to be not very serious. The fact of the matter is that the U.S. could easily do these social programs and continue its war making. That's not the reason to oppose the war making. I think that's quite right. There are other good reasons to oppose the war making. The fact of the matter is the U.S. should be spending much more on war than we are spending it now. Not for the same things, not for the so-called military budget. We should be spending much more on war in the sense of reparations. The U.S. owes an immense amount of money to the rest of the world for all those people we've killed in this generation, for all that destruction we've encompassed in the last demonstration and continue to do today. The notion that we're talking about the past and long ago is not true. This is what American foreign policy, which itself is continuous, and it's not Donald Trump's fault. This is what American foreign policy, American war policy produces. We should be not only repenting of the policy, we should be paying for it. We should be spending much more on money in a sense of reparations to the countries we've harmed.
Yeah, I mean, it would be at least to stop fighting, to stop the wars. That would be a good start.
Yes, indeed.
Repair would be even better. And just to make my usual minor technical point here, but it annoys me because people seem to fall into the trap of not understanding that there isn't enough money.
Yeah.
That there is, because there isn't enough money, that
Right.
money is being wasted on something, and
Right.
therefore it's gone. Well, again, as I've said many times on the program, if there is labor and there is resources and there is work to be done, then the government can issue the money for
Right.
for that to be done. So why that isn't done, in spite of the fact that we're spending $600 billion to $1 trillion on the Pentagon and war every year, why that isn't done is a different but related issue, and it relates to to more dull issues like who's going to be the next Federal Reserve chairperson and what their monetary policy is going to be. But what we have in this country is a monetary policy overall whose point is to favor the wealthy over the unemployed by worrying more about inflation than about unemployment. So those are basic economic issues that people need to understand.
And if we once again, if we look at the history of the United States and say what has produced social programs that really have benefited people, it's not that we found the right chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. Mm-hmm. It's not even that we found the right president to elect. What we've done is demanded from the bottom up, as it were, what you were talking about before, that something be done that is in the interest of the majority of the population, not just in the interest of the 1% or the 1/10 of 1% who own the wealth of the country. This is the only explanation for the New Deal, for the social reforms that came in as a result of the Great Depression. People demanded them, and the government, which had no particular interest in doing them, had to acquiesce. We forget that sometimes. The only advantage, the only triumphs in American social legislation in the 20th century, I can think of three, all came from demands from the bottom, not from electing the right guy or for appointing the right guy. The three I have in mind are the New Deal, the social reforms that followed the Great Depression, the Civil Rights Movement, and the withdrawal of the American armies from Vietnam. I'm going to be careful of that last one. I'm going to talk about that some in relation to the comments you made earlier, because I contend that the U.S. won the war in Vietnam, and the notion that, how did we happen to lose that? That's the wrong question. The point is that these three triumphs, such as they were, ambiguous as they were, the New Deal, civil rights, and withdrawal from Vietnam, all came from demands from below as far as the social structure of the United States is concerned. That's the only thing that's ever worked.
But yeah, and I would throw Medicare in terms of the social legislation and the war on poverty to a certain extent in the 60s. But I think it's worth pointing out that, as I just pointed out, that there is resources and labor that needs to be used, that wants to be used now in a responsible way. But what you had in the 1960s was that amidst all of this energy to put people to work, to maintain a relatively fully employed economy, the Vietnam War did create incredible stresses on that. And part of the breakdown of all that was in the late 1960s was the fact that the economy couldn't beyond everything else couldn't quote unquote afford Vietnam as well, and the business community recognized that. I mean, they were more concerned about rebellion than they were about the economy.
Well, I'm not.
But anyway, just to put that on.
It's an interesting line to pursue. I don't think it was a case that the U.S. couldn't afford the Vietnam War. We hear that sometimes from people who were critics of American policy, saying, well, of course, the problem was that Johnson had to run a guns and butter policy. Right. He had to do both. And so that wasn't the issue. That was never the issue. The issue, when the American business community, the 1%, came to Lyndon Johnson and said, wind up the Vietnam War, and that happened at a fairly specific set of meetings in 1968. When they did that, the reason was not that the economy couldn't afford it. The reason was that we were throwing good money after bad, that it was the returns of the Vietnam War didn't justify the sorts of output that's being put into it, the sorts of costs, and the costs were perhaps not most importantly economic. The costs were, as you say, in contestation in the society. We forget sometimes that the reason the U.S. withdrew from Vietnam was that the American Army revolted. The Army we sent to Vietnam, and this is not a theme that you will hear in the Burns treatment of Vietnam, the American Army that we sent to Vietnam was made up of draftees. And the draft was remarkably class-based. People who were in college during the Vietnam draft didn't have any trouble avoiding it. The sons and daughters, the daughters weren't involved, of course. The sons of the 1% didn't have any trouble staying out of the military if they wanted to. So with the army that we sent to Vietnam, the army we sent to kill the Vietnamese, who had the temerity to reject the government that we'd picked out for them, that army was a class-based army, and it was an army of people who did not volunteer except to avoid the draft. These were not people who were saying, oh, I'm fighting for freedom, as the boilerplate from the administration put it. That army refused to fight in 1973. It was up to and including fragging their officers, as the phrase had it at the time. Fragging referred to rolling a fragmentation grenade under the bunk of a particularly gung-ho officer who was going to lead the draftee army into the jungle the next day to fight the Vietnamese. No, they were stopped from that, and there were killings of American officers who were seen as too gung-ho. That was the tip of the iceberg, if you like, of the immense resistance of American draftees to fighting that war, to the point that the Nixon administration had to say, we got to bring these guys home. We can only rely perhaps on air power in Vietnam. We'll have to bomb the country back to the Stone Age, in the phrase of in Curtis LeMay's phrase, and we'll have to bring the troops home. And by the way, we'll have to end the draft because it's corrupting the Army. That was the Nixon administration position, and they carried it out. But the idea that the war was lost seems to me to be quite false if we understand why the U.S. went into the war in the first place and what it was trying to do. It didn't achieve, the U.S. government didn't achieve its maximum war aims in Vietnam, but we did win the war. You're watching News from Neptune. Carl Estabrook and David Green talking about the news of the week and its coverage by the media. There were two stories, David, that I wanted particularly to mention that seemed to me both interesting and maybe ignored, at least ignored in their significance. The first was an interview that the chief operating officer of Facebook did with a news source yesterday in the context of the Russiagate mishegas. And it seems to me that this is
I love it when you speak Yiddish.
I do it so badly.
You do it well.
Well, mishegas is a wonderful word. I mean, craziness, particularly the notion of social craziness or political craziness.
You couldn't do without it.
You couldn't do without it. That's exactly right. There's a lot of it going around. In the midst of the Russiagate nonsense, and that word is nowhere near so strong as mishegas, the chief operating officer of Facebook gave an interview yesterday in which she said Facebook will help investigators looking into Russian election meddling, but it isn't changing its core values and business plan that has powered the company's growth. Well, look, I mean, it's fashionable to criticize and even denigrate Zuckerberg and his friends at Facebook, but it seems to me that her statement yesterday was remarkably clear and accurate. I'm quoting now from a description of her interview. Sandberg held her name is Sheryl Sandberg. Sandberg held the company's long-standing hardline on free speech, saying the company would not remove the Russian-linked ads if they were posted by legitimate people and not fake accounts. Quote, "The thing about free expression is that when you allow free expression, you allow free expression." Close quote. That's Sheryl Sandberg. That's pretty good. That's quite right, particularly when this hysteria, this concocted hysteria about Russiagate is being marketed by the political class in this country in an absolutely amazing way. If you'd told me a couple of years ago that this could happen in the U.S., I would have thought you were crazy. Facebook, she said, would have run a Senate campaign ad purchased by Representative Marsha Blackburn, a Tennessee Republican, that was blocked on Twitter because of anti-abortion language. Twitter said to this congressional candidate they wouldn't run her tweets because she was opposed to abortion. And that said Twitter was inflammatory, therefore we're not going to run them. Sandberg, to her credit, said, look, when you cut off speech for one person, you cut off speech for other people. I don't know where Zuckerberg found this woman, but she obviously is.
Sheryl Sandberg is a very well-known woman. She's the lean-in woman, right? Or
no, I think you're mixing her up.
Confusing her up with
this is
But she's worked her way up in the corporate hierarchy.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sure. I mean, it's
is well known for doing so.
Sandberg said the company would not have removed the Russian-linked ads that the Russiagate people are screaming about if they had been posted by real people, not fake accounts. Quote, "The thing about free expression is that when you allow free expression, you allow free expression." I think we should put that up on the same sign that says it's not about Trump. The second point, second report that I thought was extremely important was in no way so heartening at all. The Intercept, a questionable news source in its own way occasionally, reports that in June, before Charlottesville was in the national spotlight, Charlottesville was the demonstration by the pro-Fa and anti-Fa forces, maybe we should say. And June, before Charlottesville was in the national spotlight, the city was in the last stretch of a campaign for Commonwealth attorney. Virginia is not a state, it's a Commonwealth, by the way. And the Commonwealth's attorney... Oh, God, I need more coffee before the show starts. The Commonwealth's attorney is what we in Illinois would call a state's attorney, the top prosecutor in town. There was a local election for the top prosecutor in Charlottesville. One of the candidates was running on a platform, this was before the Charlottesville demonstration, one of the candidates was running on a platform of reining in the police and rolling back mass incarceration. He was not the police department's favorite candidate. Less than 2 weeks before the election, 5 officers showed up in the middle of the night and arrested him, took him to the station house in his pajamas, at least let him put his pajamas on, and then and handcuffed him and threw him in a cell for essentially nothing. There is a report on the Intercept website about what happened that suggests that there was an important background to what the police did do, or more importantly, didn't do in the Charlottesville demonstration. People talked about the fact that the demonstrators, fascist or not, the demonstrators were allowed to run free throughout the city of Charlottesville carrying large weapons. The police not only didn't stop them, that when altercations developed, the police didn't do anything about it. And everyone at the time argued about that. I think it was the mayor, said, well, the police couldn't do anything because they were outgunned. The demonstrators were better armed than the police were, therefore the police didn't dare do anything. This is abject nonsense, of course, but it does give a key to the fact that the demonstration in Charlottesville seemed so shocking to the bien-pensants was at least aided by the local police. And when someone like Cornel West says, well, our church service would have been overrun by thugs, and our lives would have been threatened if it weren't for the Antifa people who stood up to them, that situation was set up by the local police, who refused to provide the sort of security that you would have expected from them. Now, this seems to me to put a different dimension on the thing that happened, on what happened in Charlottesville, and the larger questions that we were mentioning earlier of Antifa and demonstrations in this country. These are all, in a sense, free speech issues, and it's pretty clear that the political establishment doesn't have a deep love for free speech. So when we hear even people like the chief operating officer of Facebook speak up in its favor, we should applaud.
Yeah, I don't know what I have to add. It always seemed to be a little bit over the top for Cornel West to have claimed that their lives were in danger.
It was an obiter dictum, I think.
What do you mean? Oh, sorry, I don't.
Oh no! I mean, I'm not saying it isn't true.
Yeah.
I'm saying it wasn't a fundamental analysis of the situation.
Yeah.
It was an accidental comment, in a sense,
Yeah.
that was turned into a fundamental analysis of the situation.
Yeah.
Gee, if it weren't for Antifa, why the fascists would have run ragged, would have run riot in Charlottesville. We now know that, to the extent that that's true, it was true because of police malfeasance, because of the government's allowance of the demonstration in the form that it took.
Yeah, I'm tempted to raise, as long as we're speculating, I'm tempted to raise the issue of the NFL players and
Fun.
And as much, I mean, partly only to say that it shows a dearth of politics. It shows so much of what we read about every day is kind of like non-politics, or it's the wrong politics, or it's sort of the idea that we let Trump, to a certain extent, dictate what the political agenda is, and Trump has his role to play in the whole NFL protest, and so forth. But that has a political salience to it. I don't know exactly what it is. I've never felt that controversies about sports makes for particularly good politics or good political analysis. It's hard. Since it certainly did in the days of Black Power, in terms of John Carlos and Tommy Smith at the Mexico Olympics of 1968. I've never been that impressed. Dave Zirin has become the kind of go-to person in terms of promoting the idea that athletes can make a difference in our political culture. And I've never been convinced that this was just sort of anything more than his little niche and his hobby horse, and I get kind of bored with it when he points out, okay, this person is showing some courage, whether it's Colin Kaepernick or whomever. The Real News has been, their go-to person in regard to this has been the historian Gerald Horne, who's been commenting on the NFL players' revolt and the controversy between them and the owners. The owners first were apparently defending the NFL players against Trump's criticism, and now apparently there's more leaning towards the establishment point of view. But it's worth commenting on what the complicated relationship between race in NFL, made interesting by the nature, as we pointed out, of what's going on in the NFL now in terms of what we know about brain injury and the predominance of African American players in the NFL, their relationship to the fans, many of whom are pretty quick to turn on them, and the whole issue, of course, of black players and white quarterbacks. So there's a lot on the table there. I don't know if it's meaningful in any summative sense, but I was interested if you perhaps had a comment about that.
Well, a comment that I will post on the News from Neptune Facebook page comes from one of the leading basketball players in the country right now, LeBron James.
The leading basketball player.
Well, yeah, very definitely. Somebody sent me a picture of James wearing a T-shirt that with a series of statements. The statements are, we march, y'all mad. We sit down, y'all mad. We speak up, y'all mad. We die, y'all silent.
Whoa.
That's heavy and accurate.
Yeah.
And quite remarkable. And the picture of LeBron James, premier athlete, as you say, wearing the T-shirt, I think says as much about this controversy as the various attempts to turn it off into other issues like the flag and respect for the military, since we shouldn't have any respect for the military in terms of what the American military is doing right now. That is an issue that really should be contested. The whole business of singing the national anthem and people standing or kneeling or whatever for that should be considered even in terms of its specific content. Go read the third verse of the national anthem. It's rarely sung. Read the third verse of the national anthem, which is an attack on those who would abolish slavery. The third verse of the national anthem supports slavery. That's why you don't hear it normally before the games. But if you look at the context in which the verse was written, the War of 1812 and Francis Scott Key, a Southern gentleman, you will understand what it is that the verse was talking about. The backstory is rather interesting. The the British attackers in the War of 1812, tried to convince American slaves to come over to the British side because, obviously, the continuation of slavery was one of the things the war was about. The Americans wanted to continue slavery, and Britain had moved to the abolition of slavery. This is an important story, and by the way, it has a background in the Revolutionary War, too. It really was the reason for the Revolutionary War, the fact that the source of wealth of the 1% in America in 1776, North and South, was slavery, and the Brits were moving to abolish it, not necessarily for noble reasons, but that's the way they were going, if only to deal with the competition of the American economy. That 1812 was the denouement of the American Revolution, and in that war, the Brits specifically said to American slaves, come over to our side and we'll give you your freedom. That's what we're doing in Britain these days, if you haven't heard. So the Star-Spangled Banner was written to condemn this British interference with slavery. Now, in these circumstances, standing in respect to the national anthem, specifically in a much larger way, in respect to the war as being carried on under the banner of that flag, that seems to me quite a reasonable thing to do.
Yeah. The aforementioned Gerald Horne is certainly one of probably the primary historian who's brought in all this history of what he calls the counter-revolution of 1776.
That's right.
And even Gerald Horne, in his comments on the Real News, can't resist or just is inclined to simply put all the onus on Donald Trump. You know,
well,
I mean,
hey, look, that's what's happening.
Trump derangement syndrome includes even him. He just somehow can't step back from it a little. And okay, five minutes, and we'll. It just the reason why I'm loath to raise the issue. It's hard to get to a general point in understanding how sports works. Certainly, we need to be thinking about how sports works. It's easier as an older person. I've been a sports fan my whole life. I've pretty much given up football for many years, and you can and I still like other sports. But still, it's like you get a perspective on this without wanting to take away the pleasure that people get from, having a team they root for. I don't have any problem with that. But it's gone to certain lengths in this neoliberal, capitalistic, commodified context that are just out of control, and that everything gets implicated in the way sports are done, and black football or basketball players who are going for the gold ring and getting very wealthy in doing so find themselves compromised, as LeBron James, who's always been criticized for his lack of political commentary. And I don't know whether that necessarily means there's going to be any kind of sea change in the things he's going to say. Again, I don't think we could depend on athletes to really. I don't think the revolution is going to begin with them. But you never know. But it's got to be somehow put into a framework where the broader perspective is brought in.
Well, you alerted us to before, David, to the remarkable willingness of the American military to participate not only in professional sports but in college sports as well. A flyby of
my famous flyover.
Exactly. We're running out of time. You have been watching.
We'll fly over next week.
Well, God willing. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 41st week of 2017, presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green. Produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Ethan Young, and Andrew Scollery, with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson for research. See No's notes on the website, newsfromneptune.com. The local anti-war group that we mentioned earlier, AWARE, will be at the farmers market tomorrow, that's Saturday, in Urbana, and welcome to come by and talk about the things we've been talking about here today, see some of our literature and literature from other people on these and related matters. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.